Mike. Well, indeed, it's been a year since the country experienced the worst riots in the history of the country's democracy. When you look at what transpired in terms of the scale of destruction which was experienced in most parts of KwaZulu-Natal as well as some parts of Gauteng. As you can see, perhaps in our visuals, you know, the destruction is still very much visible, and the rebuilding process still very much underway in some parts of in the areas where, you know, the destruction was experienced. And of course, we are expecting the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal at about midday today to give us an update in terms of the progress that has been made by the province of KwaZulu-Natal in trying to perhaps get things back to normality. But to take this conversation forward, I'm joined by my colleague Ayanda Mhlongo. Ayanda, exactly a year, you know, since South Africa experienced the worst riots in the history of the country's young democracy, and I suppose nobody could have predicted the scale of destruction that we experienced.
Yes, certainly, Simphiwe. I mean, you know that we were on the ground and where the situation sort of unfolded from, having spent those days in Kandla and those days leading up to former President Jacob Zuma handing himself over to correctional services officials, and then the start of his incarceration at the Escort Correctional Facility. But nobody could, as you said, predicted what was going to happen during those times. And I tell you, we could say it in words. No amount of words, visuals and pictures that we could show could actually show the extent of the damage, but most importantly, what it did to individuals, what it did to the people of this province. To say that people were living in fear during that time, Simphiwe, would have been an understatement. People were petrified. And we saw what happened when the law enforcement agencies in some areas were nowhere to be seen. Clearly, we do know that they had their hands full. It was an unprecedented a situation for law enforcement agencies in this country, and so communities themselves in fear started to come together, to rally together. Private security companies as well were called in to come and assist. They were not many people in residential areas, even here, even in townships, people were afraid, petrified for their lives, and people did their best to go out and protect their neighborhoods. Just to show, I mean, it was the first time in my life that we traveled in areas that we had to stop, but people had created roadblocks, and we had to have some sort of identification, whether you had a water bill to show that you lived in this particular neighborhood, whether we had to produce our media cards to identify ourselves as journalists. And I know for yourself as well, never since we started being journalists, and we've also spoken to journalists who have been in the field for many, many years, pre-1994 and even, you know, before 1994, to say that had they seen anything like it, had they experienced these blockages, communities coming together out of fear, and many will tell you that they had not. So indeed, for me, the damage was extensive. And we are here at Bridge City Mall. Of course, we remember that on the 16th of July, this is the first stop that the president made in his assessment of the damage in the province. And we're just looking at the stores here. This is the biggest mall in this area, Simphiwe, that services the Inanda and Tuzuma, Kwamashu townships, really big townships. And this was the biggest mall that services communities around here. I was just looking at the number of stores here, and just clothing and footwear stores alone, there were 33 shops that have been destroyed, affecting locals who would come here to buy. But more than that, the jobs, the hundreds of jobs that have been created by this mall. And so for the past year, people have not been able to work. So you then look at that the destruction is one part of it, but what were the consequences of it and how it affected people's lives? You'll be reminded just recently there was the reports of the national shutdown. And on that day, driving through the streets of Durban, it was dead quiet. Businesses decided to close. Even parents decided to keep their children away from school. People did not go to work. And I think that for us just shows how scared, how petrified people were of those events of July, and how whenever now there's talk of a national shutdown, there's talk of a protest, it just reminds people of those days that I think nobody wants to go back to that situation.
Speaking of that, Ayanda, I mean, who can forget the fact that when the killings in Phoenix happened, another issue was brought to the fore, which is the issue of racial tensions in this province, which was rather unfortunate, where we had different government officials, terming it differently. Some were saying that it's a massacre. Some would say not so. But just in terms of the lives that have been changed by this event, Ayanda, many people, as you are saying, are still without jobs. Look at the scale of destruction that is behind us. Where to from here?
Well, certainly a lot more work still has to be done in Simphiwe. This is what we're getting from community organizations, from churches that have been working with, for example, in the area of Phoenix, Bambai, Amawoti, where we saw very much these clashes between residents living in those areas and the racial tensions, saying that there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. Of course, on the one hand, you had people that were fearful for their lives, that decided because there were no police, because there were no law enforcement agencies, that they had to go out and protect themselves, protect their families, protect their homes. There were also the victims of the unrest, people who say we were innocently just driving past on our way to search for service stations. We wanted to fill up petrol because petrol had run out in our area, so we just wanted to get to a shop. And so you have those people as well who are all seeking closure from this situation. But I think when earlier on you were speaking to Mam Precious Lugayeni, she mentioned that people need closure. And the only way that people, and this is what we're getting from the people that we've been speaking to as we look back on the year, for them to be able to move on. People are saying to us, we need to know who was responsible for this violence. The government at the time and the police had said there were 12 instigators. Who are these 12 instigators? We don't know. Who is responsible for this so that it does not happen again? And people want justice. In Phoenix, you know that there were about 37 people that were killed. Only 56 people were arrested at the time. Currently, there are no less than 5 cases that are still in courts. In the different courts, one in the magistrates' court and in the high courts. And the victims of this violence are saying that is simply not enough. We need people who are responsible for committing murders, people who are responsible for the violence to be arrested. And that is going to, as they say to us, assist in this journey or in this process of finding closure, in this process of recovery. Of course, as well, as much as we focused on Phoenix in terms of the racial tensions, I mean, you go into Phoenix now, Simphiwe, and people are getting along. It's an unfortunate situation that happened at that time, but we do know that behind the scenes, there are organizations that are working very closely with the community. There are churches that are leading the social cohesion committee that are working with the community in those areas. We also know that school children have also been involved in these programs. There are sports programs between children from one area playing with children from the other area. And so this is an effort to try and rebuild these communities and relations with these communities. But it's certainly still a long way. It's going to be a process for the communities to hopefully get to a point where they put this behind them.
Indeed, my colleague putting it nicely there, saying that it's going to be a long way to go for the province of KwaZulu-Natal to rebuild. As you can see, the trail of destruction that is still visible in most of the areas that were affected, by the riots in July. And of course, as I said earlier on, that the Premier of KwaZulu-Natal will be providing an update in terms of the situation as it stands from the province with regards to the efforts of rebuilding. But of course, the issue of jobs, the issue of livelihoods that have been affected by these, riots, still very much, touching a number of people across the province. Let me now link back to Johannesburg in studio.